She didn't argue when she closed the door. That was what unsettled him. He was used to resistance, to negotiation, but the woman walking away from him now didn't need words. He had won every battle except the one that mattered. I waited too long. He said nothing. Sterling Ashford stood motionless on the porch of his white mansion, watching the black SUV idle at the end of his driveway. The early morning sun filtered through the ancient oaks lining Willow Creek estate, casting long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns that stretched like green oceans toward a horizon he could no longer reach. Inside that vehicle sat the woman he loved. 10 years had passed since he'd felt color return to his world after losing his wife, and now, standing there in the Kansas heat with his heart pounding and his hands clenched, it felt like everything was slipping away again. The SUV's engine purred. She gave him a small wave, an offering of peace perhaps, or farewell. Then the gravel crunched under the wheels, and she was gone. Just like that. No screaming, no tears, no dramatic scene. She simply left. And Sterling, billionaire CEO, master negotiator, the man who bent city councils and corporate boards to his will, realized with brutal clarity that he was powerless. This wasn't rejection. This was consequence. But let's rewind, because every ending has a beginning, and this one started 4 months earlier in the most unlikely place, a parent lounge at Sunnyvale Elementary School, where Sterling Ashford had absolutely no business falling in love. He wasn't looking for romance that afternoon. He was simply picking up his 10-year-old daughter, Aria, like he did every Tuesday and Thursday. Sterling had been a widower for a decade, long enough that the ache of loss had dulled into something manageable, something he could control. And control was what Sterling did best. He controlled quarterly earnings. He controlled real estate portfolios. He controlled every variable in his carefully ordered life. Except, apparently, the moment Aria's classroom door opened and she walked out. Simone Jacobs, a young black teacher with an open smile, kind brown eyes framed by natural curls, and a warmth that radiated like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She carried a stack of worksheets in one arm and a box of crayons in the other, laughing at something Aria had just said. Sterling's daughter bounded toward him, throwing herself into his arms with the unfiltered joy only children possess. And Simone followed, smiling that gentle smile, completely unaware that she'd just shattered something in Sterling's chest. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice like honey. "Aria did beautifully on her art project today. He should have said thank you, should have nodded politely and walked away. Instead, the words tumbled out before his brain could stop them. I will make you mine." The hallway fell silent. Simone froze, her smile faltering. Sterling felt his face flush hot with immediate regret. What kind of man says that to a woman he's just met? A controlling one, apparently. The kind who spent too many years issuing commands and expecting compliance. Simone recovered quickly, forcing a polite smile. "Thank you," she said carefully, as if brushing off a stray comment. "I'm sure we'll work well together this year." But her eyes told a different story. They were wary now, guarded. Sterling stammered an apology, grabbed Aria's hand, and fled to his SUV like a man escaping a crime scene. The drive home was torture. Aria chattered about finger painting and recess, but Sterling couldn't focus. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tight. His jaw clenched. He was a CEO who commanded boardrooms without breaking a sweat, and he'd just fumbled an introduction like a teenager. That night, spreadsheets sat untouched on his laptop. Board reports gathered. Dust. All he could think about was Simone Jacobs, the way her shoulders had relaxed when she realized he meant no harm, the laugh lines around her eyes, the warmth in her voice. He was 42 years old, and for the first time in a decade, he felt something other than numbness. It terrified him. So he did what any rational, slightly obsessed man would do. He joined the school volunteer committee, ostensibly to help Aria. Really, to catch glimpses of Simone at book fairs and fundraisers. He offered supporting hands and encouraging words. She remained polite but cautious, keeping professional distance like a shield. At staff meetings, she called him Mr. Ashford. At school events, she smiled warmly but never lingered. When he invited her for coffee after choir practice, she declined. "Papers to grade," she said gently. Sterling nodded and waited. He wasn't used to taking no for an answer, but he'd learned, slowly, painfully, that pressuring people did more harm than good. So he waited, and watched, and hoped. Then came that crisp Saturday morning at the farmer's market. Sterling was buying pumpkin pies for one of Aria's quirky midnight breakfast traditions when he saw her, Simone, browsing fresh vegetables, her hair pulled back in a colorful scarf. He approached carefully, offering to carry her bags. She hesitated, then smiled. "That's kind of you." And just like that, the ice began to crack. She introduced him to her mother, Ruby, who sold homemade vegetable stew from a booth decorated with sunflowers and worn quilts. Ruby's face lit up when she saw them together. "Sit," she insisted, ladling steaming bowls. "You both look like you need good food and good company." Sterling sat. He listened to Simone talk about family and community, watched her laugh with her mother, and felt something shift inside him. He was fitting into this scene, this warm, unpolished, real scene, in a way he never fit into boardrooms or galas. When Ruby sent them each home with thermoses of stew, Simone grinned at him. "I knew you'd like it," she whispered. And Sterling realized she'd remembered. She'd paid attention. Small details mattered to her. People mattered to her. He mattered to her. But here's the question that should have haunted him then, the question he should have asked himself before everything fell apart. When you're used to controlling everything in your life, how do you learn to simply love someone without trying to own them? By the time autumn turned to winter, Sterling Ashford had convinced himself he'd finally figured out love. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. All he knew was that Simone Jacobs had become the center of his carefully controlled universe, and for the first time since his wife's death, the mansion at Willow Creek Estate didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt like home. They'd fallen into a rhythm, lunch meetings at cozy cafes near the school, evening phone calls that stretched past midnight, weekends, where Simone would bring her grandmother's old blues records and Sterling would teach her to swing dance in his grand ballroom. Aria adored her. Ruby welcomed him into family gatherings with open arms. Everything was perfect. Except nothing in life stays perfect, does it? Especially when you're a man who spent 42 years believing that control equals love, that solving problems equals caring, that power can substitute for partnership. The cracks started small. So small Sterling didn't even notice them at first. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when Simone mentioned the art program budget cuts at school. They were sitting at his dining table, a massive oak thing that could seat 20 but usually sat 2, eating. Take-out Chinese food straight from the containers because Simone insisted it tasted better that way. She talked about how the district had slashed funding, how she'd have to make do with half the supplies, how some of her students might not get the materials they needed. Her voice carried frustration but also determination. This was a woman who'd fought for everything she'd earned, who understood that obstacles were just problems waiting to be solved. Sterling listened, nodding, his mind already 3 steps ahead, already fixing it, already controlling the situation. "Since I can influence some seats on the school board," he said casually, twirling lo mein around his fork, "I'll get you extra funding for the art program. Don't worry about it. I'll handle the paperwork. Probably have it sorted by Friday." Simone's fork paused mid-air. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Something Sterling couldn't quite read. Then she forced a gentle smile. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but the PTA has things covered. I'm fine with the budget we have." Her voice was calm. Too calm. The warmth had flickered from her eyes like a candle in a draught. Sterling frowned, genuinely puzzled. Why would she turn down help? It made no sense. In his world, when someone offered to solve your problem, you said thank you and let them solve it. That's how things worked. That's how efficiency worked. "It's really no trouble," he insisted, leaning forward. "You shouldn't have to worry about budgeting and fighting bureaucracy. I'll fix everything in a minute." One phone call, Simone. That's all it takes. Sterling. She set her fork down with deliberate care, the way you'd handle something fragile that might break. I know you mean well. I do. But I can do this. I chose teaching art because I love doing it, not to have someone else call the shots. The gentleness in her voice couldn't hide the steel underneath. The resolve in her eyes was sharp enough to cut. Sterling felt a jolt of frustration ripple through his chest. She was contradicting him, refusing help, making things harder than they needed to be. It's what I do, he replied, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. I'm just trying to help. In my world, when there's a problem, you use every resource at your disposal to fix it. I don't understand why you'd want to struggle when you don't have to. Her face fell. Just for a second, he saw hurt flash across her features before she masked it with composure. I'm not a project, she whispered. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. I'm not asking for your help. Sterling opened his mouth to respond, to explain that he wasn't treating her like a project, that he just wanted to make her life easier, that this was love, wasn't it? Solving problems for the people you cared about. But before he could speak, Aria's voice called out from the living room where she'd been doing homework. Daddy, I thought you said you'd help me with my math problem. Sterling turned toward his daughter, forcing a smile. Coming, sweetheart. The moment broke. He stood, gathered his plate, and walked away. Behind him, Simone remained at the table, cleaning up in silence. The distance between them felt suddenly vast, like they were standing on opposite sides of a canyon neither of them knew how to cross. Sterling's chest tightened with something he couldn't name, not quite guilt, not quite regret, but something close. He'd tried to use his influence in her life, and somehow, impossibly, it had hurt her. But he told himself it was fine. A small disagreement, nothing that couldn't be smoothed over. After all, he'd apologized, sort of, and she'd accepted, sort of. They were fine, weren't they? The thing about cracks, though, is that they don't heal themselves. They spread. 3 weeks later came the promotion. Simone burst through his front door on a Friday afternoon, her face glowing, with excitement, waving a letter like it was a winning lottery ticket. Sterling, I got it. I got the advanced placement art position. She was breathless, radiant, practically vibrating with joy. Aria squealed and hugged her. Sterling felt his heart swell watching them together, his daughter and the woman he loved, celebrating this moment. He pulled Simone into his arms, kissed the top of her head. That's incredible, he murmured. I'm so proud of you. And he was. He genuinely was. But then she explained the details. The advanced placement class met 3 nights a week after regular school hours. She'd be home late on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, sometimes not until 8 or 9 at night. It was a dream opportunity, a chance to work with talented students, to really make an impact, to advance her career in a field she was passionate about. She talked fast, hands gesturing, eyes bright. Sterling listened, and with each word, a cold knot formed in his stomach. 3 nights a week, late hours, less time together, less time with Aria. His mind immediately jumped to logistics. Who would help with homework on those nights? What about dinner? What about their routine? The carefully constructed schedule that made everything work. He could feel control slipping through his fingers like sand. That night, after Aria was in bed, Sterling approached the subject carefully. They were in his study, Simone curled up on the leather sofa with a glass of wine, Sterling standing by the fireplace because he couldn't quite sit still. I've been thinking, he started, choosing his words with the precision he used in board meetings, about your promotion. She looked up, smiling. Isn't it amazing? I've wanted this for years, Sterling. Years. It is amazing, he agreed. You deserve it. But what if you took some time off instead? The words came out smoother than he'd intended, almost rehearsed. You've been working so hard, Simone. You deserve a break. Maybe take a sabbatical, travel, spend time with family. We could go somewhere. Europe, maybe. Or the Caribbean. Aria would love it. You could come back to teaching refreshed, you know? The silence that followed was deafening. Simone stared at him like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. Her smile faded slowly, replaced by something Sterling couldn't quite interpret. Confusion? Disappointment? Anger? Take time off, she repeated slowly. Sterling, this is a great opportunity for the school, for me, for my career. I worked hard to earn this. Why would I just give it up? There was an edge to her voice now, sharp and brittle. Sterling felt his frustration rising. Why couldn't she see he was trying to help? You just work too hard, he said, hearing the defensiveness creeping into his tone. You're always stressed about supplies, about students, about district policies. Why not let me handle some things? You don't have to carry everything yourself. Handle things? Her voice rose slightly. She set down her wineglass with a sharp clink. What does that even mean, Sterling? Handle my career, handle my choices. That's not what I deserve to live my life, she cut him off, standing now, arms crossed defensively. I'm not your employee to put on leave. I'm not a problem you need to solve. This is my dream, Sterling. Mine. And you're asking me to throw it away because… what? Because it's inconvenient for your schedule. The words hit him like a slap. Sterling felt his jaw clench, that familiar boardroom instinct rising, the urge to assert control, to make his case, to win the argument. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was his living room, and the woman standing across from him wasn't a business rival. She was the woman he loved, and he was losing her. He could see it in her eyes. That look. The same look she'd given him that first day in the school hallway, when he'd said those stupid, controlling words. Wary, guarded, disappointed. I didn't mean it like that, he said quietly, running a hand through his hair. I worry about you, about us, about how we'll make this work. Make it work? Simone laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sterling, couples make things work. They compromise. They support each other. They don't ask each other to give up their dreams for convenience. She grabbed her coat from the back of the sofa. I think I should go home tonight. Simone. I need space, Sterling. I need to think. She walked toward the door, and Sterling felt panic rise in his chest. This was wrong. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to go. She'd gotten her dream promotion, and instead of celebrating, they were fighting. Because of him. Because he'd suggested she throw it all away. Because somewhere deep in his psyche, he'd wanted to keep her close, to maintain control, even if it meant clipping her wings. The door closed softly behind her. No slam, no dramatic exit, just a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than any argument. Sterling stood alone in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and expensive art and all the trappings of success, and realized that none of it mattered. None of it could fix what he'd just broken. But even then, even standing there in the wreckage of his own making, Sterling Ashford didn't fully understand what he'd done wrong. Because when you've spent your entire life believing that power equals love, that control equals caring, how do you unlearn that? How do you stop trying to orchestrate every outcome, manage every variable, fix every problem? How do you learn to just let go? The answer is, you don't, not until you lose everything. The next few days passed in strained silence. Simone returned his calls but kept conversations brief. She was cordial when they spoke, professional almost, like she'd erected walls he couldn't scale. Sterling tried to apologize, tried to explain, but every word felt inadequate. I support you, he'd say, and she'd respond with, do you? It was maddening. He did support her. He just wanted what was best for her. Couldn't she see that? On Tuesday, they had dinner again, at her insistence because she believed in working through problems, not running from them. They sat at the same oak table where this had all started to unravel. Aria was at a sleepover, so it was just the two of them, navigating conversation like sailors in treacherous waters. Sterling tried to be present, to listen, to not offer solutions. He asked about her day. She talked about her students with that familiar warmth, her voice animated when she described a breakthrough with a struggling artist. Sterling watched her, captivated by her passion, and felt his heart ache with how much he loved this woman, how much he wanted to keep her, how terrified he was of losing her. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Simone sat on one end of the sofa, Sterling on the other, a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm between them. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, winter wind rattled the windows. "Sterling," Simone said finally, breaking the silence. "Can I ask you something? Anything? Why did you really suggest I take time off?" He hesitated. This felt like a trap, but he couldn't lie to her. "I wanted more time with you," he admitted. "I wanted things to stay the way they are, the way they were. Comfortable," she said. It wasn't a question. Controlled. Manageable. Sterling flinched. "That's not—" "It is, though." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Sterling, I think you're a good man. I think you have a good heart. But I also think you're terrified of anything you can't control. And you can't control me. You can't control my career, or my choices, or my independence. And every time you try, you push me further away." The truth of her words settled over him like a weight. Sterling opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, but what could he say? She was right. He did want control. He always had. In business, control meant success. It meant preventing disasters, maximizing profits, ensuring outcomes. But love wasn't business, was it? Love was messy and unpredictable and required trust in things you couldn't manage. Sterling had forgotten that. Or maybe he'd never learned it in the first place. "I don't know how to not be this way," he confessed quietly. The admission felt like pulling out his own teeth. "I don't know how to care about someone without trying to fix everything for them." Simone's expression softened. She moved closer, closing some of the distance between them. "I don't need you to fix me, Sterling. I need you to stand beside me. Not in front of me, not behind me. Beside me. As a partner. As an equal." "I can do that," he said quickly. Too quickly. She smiled sadly. "Can you? Because every time something comes up, your first instinct is to take over, to solve it, to control the outcome, and I can't live like that. I won't." The conversation ended there, not with resolution but with exhaustion. Simone stayed that night, in the guest room, another physical manifestation of distance, and left early the next morning before Sterling woke up. He found a note on the kitchen counter. "I love you, but I need you to really think about what I said, about what you want, about whether you're capable of the kind of partnership I need." Sterling read the note 3 times, feeling each word like a punch to the gut. She loved him. But love wasn't enough, was it? Not when one person kept trying to orchestrate the other's life. Not when control masqueraded as care. He went to work that day but couldn't focus. Board meetings blurred together. His assistant asked if he was feeling well. Sterling waved her off with a forced smile. That evening, instead of calling Simone, he did something unusual. He reflected. He sat in his study with a glass of bourbon he didn't drink, staring at the fire, and forced himself to examine his behavior with the same analytical precision he applied to business deals. What he saw wasn't pretty. He saw a man who'd learned early that power could protect you from pain, that if you controlled your environment, you controlled your fate, that if you made all the decisions, you couldn't be hurt by anyone else's choices. He saw a man who'd loved his first wife, but had also, if he was honest, managed her, suggested her charity work, influenced her social circles, made decisions about their home, their schedule, their life. She'd never complained. She'd seemed happy. But had she simply accommodated his need for control because that's what women of her generation did? Sterling felt sick. His wife had died in a car accident 10 years ago. Sudden, uncontrollable, a stark reminder that some things couldn't be managed no matter how much power you wielded. After her death, he doubled down on control. If he couldn't protect the people he loved from random tragedy, he'd at least protect them from everything else. He'd micromanage every detail, anticipate every problem, fix every issue before it became a crisis. Arya had grown up with a father who loved her fiercely but also orchestrated her life like a military campaign. Tutors and activities and schedules, all designed to give her the best possible outcome. And she was thriving, wasn't she? She was happy. But was that because of his control, or in spite of it? And now, Simone. Beautiful, independent, strong Simone, who didn't need his money or his influence or his problem-solving, who needed a partner, not a manager, who was walking away because Sterling couldn't separate love from control. The realization crashed over him like cold water. This was a pattern. This was who he'd become. And if he didn't change, fundamentally, deeply change, he was going to lose her. The question was, could he? Could a 42-year-old man who'd spent his entire adult life wielding power learn to lay it down? Could he trust someone else to make their own decisions, even if those decisions created uncertainty in his carefully ordered world? Could he love without controlling? Sterling didn't know, but he had to try. The next morning he called Simone. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Please, just give me a few hours." She hesitated, and in that hesitation Sterling heard all her doubts, all her fears that he'd never really change. But finally she said, "Okay, where?" "You'll see." He picked her up at noon, drove 40 minutes outside the city to a place he hadn't visited in over a decade, a small community center in a low-income neighborhood where he'd volunteered in his 20s before wealth and power had seduced him into thinking he could fix the world from the top down. The center was still there, still running programs for at-risk youth, still scraping by on donated resources and sheer determination. Sterling had sent them checks over the years, large checks, but he hadn't actually set foot inside since before his first marriage. They walked in together, and Sterling was immediately greeted by Maria, the center's director. A 60-year-old woman with grey hair and hands that had seen decades of hard work. "Sterling Ashford," she said warmly, pulling him into a hug. "I can't believe it's really you. It's been, what, 15 years? Too long," he admitted. He introduced Simone, and Maria's eyes lit up with understanding. "Ah," she said, smiling. "So, this is why you're here." They spent the afternoon at the center. Sterling didn't write a check, didn't offer to solve problems, didn't make phone calls or pull strings. He just participated. He helped kids with homework, listened to a teenager explain her dreams of becoming an architect, played basketball with a group of boys who had no idea he was a billionaire. Simone watched him, and Sterling could feel her observation like a physical weight. This was his test. This was him showing her that he could be present without being controlled, that he could contribute without dominating, that he could care without fixing. On the drive home, Simone was quiet. Sterling's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Finally she spoke. "Why did you take me there?" "Because I needed you to see that I'm capable of showing up without taking over," he said honestly. "That I can be part of something without running it. That I can—" He trailed off, searching for words. "That I can exist in a space where I'm not in control and still find meaning in it." Simone was silent for a long moment. Then she reached over and placed her hand on his. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental. "That's the first step," she said quietly. "But Sterling, it's just the first step. You can't perform change for me. You have to actually change. For yourself, for us, for Arya." "I know," he said. And he did. He really did. But knowing and doing are two very different things. The following week, Sterling tried. He really tried. When Simone mentioned a conflict with a parent at school, he listened without offering to call the superintendent. When Arya struggled with a group project and came to him frustrated, he helped her brainstorm solutions, instead of calling her teacher to reassign the groups. When the cleaning service messed up the schedule at the estate, he adjusted instead of firing them and hiring a new company. Small things, baby steps toward relinquishing control. It was exhausting. Every instinct screamed at him to take charge, to fix, to manage. His brain literally hurt from restraining himself. But he did it. For Simone. For them. And things seemed to improve. Simone smiled more. The warmth returned to her eyes. She stayed over more nights, and the guest room remained empty. They laughed together again, made plans for Christmas, talked about introducing Simone formally to Sterling's corporate colleagues at the New Year's gala. Sterling let himself believe they'd turned a corner. Then came the Tuesday that shattered everything. It was mid-December, 2 weeks before Christmas. Sterling was in his home office reviewing contracts when his phone rang. It was Richard Pemberton, head of the school board, and a man whose campaign Sterling had funded 3 years ago. "Sterling, we need to talk about the elementary school budget," Richard said without preamble. Sterling frowned. "What about it?" "There's a push to cut arts programs across the district. We're hemorrhaging money and something has to give. I'm calling because I know you've been involved with one of the art teachers." The implication was clear. Richard was offering Sterling a heads up, a chance to intervene, to protect Simone's program before the vote happened, to use his influence to save her job, her passion, her work. The old Sterling would have jumped at the opportunity, would have made the calls, applied the pressure, ensured the outcome, would have solved the problem before Simone even knew there was a problem. But the new Sterling, the one trying desperately to change, hesitated. "Richard, I appreciate the call, but I'm not going to get involved," Sterling heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth. "The board should make the decision based on what's best for students, not based on my personal connections." Richard sounded surprised. "You sure? This could really hurt your friend." "She's more than a friend," Sterling said quietly. "And that's exactly why I can't interfere. She wouldn't want me to." They ended the call. Sterling sat in his office, heart pounding, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd had a chance to protect Simone, to save her program, and he'd refused, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. Because she'd asked him to let her fight her own battles. Because she'd told him she wasn't a project. But God, it hurt not to act. It hurt to sit with the knowledge that something bad might happen to the woman he loved, and to choose, deliberately, painfully choose, not to swoop in and fix it. Was this what partnership felt like? This awful balance between caring and controlling? This terrible space where you loved someone enough to let them face their own challenges even when you had the power to spare them? Sterling didn't tell Simone about the call. Not that night at dinner. Not when she talked excitedly about a new mural project with her students. Not when she kissed him goodnight and whispered that she loved him. He kept a secret like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold. 3 days later, the school board announced the budget cuts. Arts programs across the district were being eliminated. Teachers would be reassigned. Simone's advanced placement position was gone. Sterling got the news from a text alert. He'd signed up for district announcements weeks ago, part of his obsessive need to stay informed. His first instinct was to grab his phone, call Richard, fix this immediately. His hand actually reached for the phone, but he stopped, because Simone wouldn't want that. She'd want to handle this herself. She'd want to fight this battle on her own terms. So Sterling sat on his hands, literally sat on them, and waited. Simone called him 2 hours later. She was crying, not sobbing, just quiet tears that made her voice thick and uneven. "They cut the program, Sterling. They just cut it, all of it. Years of work, all those students, everything I'd built, gone." Sterling's heart shattered. "I'm so sorry," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "What can I do?" "Nothing," she whispered. "There's nothing anyone can do. The vote was unanimous. It's over." Sterling closed his eyes, jaw clenched so tight his teeth hurt. There was something he could do. He could call Richard, could threaten to pull funding from campaigns, could make this go away with 3 phone calls and 20 minutes of his time. Could save her program, save her job, save everything. But if he did that, he'd lose her. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually, because she'd know he'd gone behind her back. Because she'd feel managed instead of supported. Because he'd have proven that he valued control more than her autonomy. So Sterling said the hardest words of his life. "Okay, I'm here if you need me, but I trust you to handle this however you think is best." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, Sterling thought she'd hung up. Then, very quietly, Simone said, "Thank you." They talked for another hour. Sterling listened, really listened, as she processed the disappointment. The anger, the grief of losing something she'd worked so hard for. He didn't offer solutions, didn't suggest alternatives, didn't try to fix anything. He just held space for her pain. When they finally hung up, Sterling sat in his study and wept. Not for Simone's lost program, though that hurt, but for the realization of what love actually required. It required watching someone you loved suffer and not intervening. It required trusting them to find their own way even when you could clear the path. It required humility and restraint and faith in someone else's strength. It required letting go, and Sterling had let go. He'd actually done it. He'd chosen her autonomy over his control. He'd chosen partnership over power. For the first time in his life, Sterling Ashford had held the tools to fix a problem and deliberately set them aside. It should have felt like victory, like progress, like proof that he was changing, that he was becoming the man Simone needed. Instead, it felt like failure, because Simone was still hurting. The problem still existed, and Sterling was still the man with the power to make it go away, but he didn't. And that choice, that awful, necessary choice, would either save their relationship or destroy it. Sterling didn't know which. All he knew was that he'd reached the edge of his own transformation, the point where old patterns and new behaviors collided. And the woman he loved was walking through fire while he stood on the sidelines, choosing trust over control for the first time in his life. Was it enough? Could love survive in the gap between what you wanted to do and what you should do? Could Simone see his restraint as respect rather than indifference? Could Sterling live with himself if he had the power to help her but chose not to use it? These questions haunted him as December dragged toward Christmas. Simone threw herself into fighting the budget cuts, organizing parent meetings, presenting alternatives to the board, rallying community support. Sterling attended the meetings as a supportive partner, sitting in the audience instead of at the head table, contributing ideas when asked but never dominating the conversation. It was agony, watching her work so hard, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, knowing he could end this with a single phone call. But he didn't. He held strong. And slowly, painfully, something shifted. Simone stopped seeing him as the man who tried to fix everything. She started seeing him as the man who stood beside her, who believed in her capability, who trusted her strength, who loved her enough to let her fight her own battles even when he desperately wanted to fight them for her. On Christmas Eve, after Aria had gone to bed with visions of presents dancing, in her head, Sterling and Simone sat by the fireplace in his study. The room glowed with candlelight and the soft crackle of burning wood. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing Willow Creek Estate in white. "I need to tell you something," Sterling said quietly. Simone looked up from her wineglass, eyebrows raised. Sterling took a deep breath. 3 weeks ago, Richard Pemberton called me, before the budget cuts were announced. He offered me a chance to intervene, to use my influence to save your program. He watched her face carefully, saw the emotions flicker across it, surprise, understanding, something that might have been anger or might have been hurt. "I didn't do it," he continued quickly. "I told him no, because you'd asked me not to interfere, because you'd told me you weren't a project. And I need you to know that it was the hardest thing I've ever done, sitting on that information, watching you go through this, knowing I could have prevented it." The silence that followed felt eternal. Simone set down her wineglass with careful deliberation. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to know I'm trying," Sterling said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to know that I'm learning, that I understand what you need from me, even when it goes against every instinct I have, that I love you enough to let you be who you are, not who I think you should be." Simone's eyes filled with tears. She moved across the sofa, closing the distance between them, and took his face in her hands. "Sterling," she whispered, "that might be the most loving thing anyone has ever done for me." She kissed him then, and Sterling felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for months, maybe years, maybe his whole life. This was what love felt like when you stopped trying to control it. This was what partnership looked like when you trusted someone else's strength. This was what respect meant when you valued someone's autonomy more than your own need to fix things. But here's the thing about transformation. It's never complete. You don't just flip a switch and become a different person. You stumble. You backslide. You make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are catastrophic. It happened on a cold January morning, 3 days after New Year's. Simone had been fighting the budget cuts for 6 weeks with no success. The board had voted, the decision was final, and her program was officially eliminated. She'd been reassigned to teach general art classes, still meaningful work, but not the advanced placement position she'd earned, not the dream she'd built. Sterling watched her process the grief, watched her accept the loss with grace and dignity, and felt something inside him crack. This woman he loved was suffering. This brilliant, passionate educator was being undervalued by a system too blind to see her worth. And he had the power to change it. He'd had the power all along. One phone call. That's all it would take. One conversation with Richard, maybe a strategic donation to the district, and he could restore everything Simone had lost. He could make her happy again. He could fix this. So on that cold January morning, while Simone was at school and Aria was at a friend's house, Sterling picked up the phone and made the call he'd sworn he wouldn't make. "Richard," he said when the board president answered, "let's talk about restoring funding to the elementary arts program." It took 15 minutes, a commitment to fund a new district initiative, a donation to Richard's next campaign, and a carefully worded suggestion that cutting arts programs might not play well with voters. Professional, strategic, effective. By the end of the call, Richard agreed to bring a motion to the next board meeting to restore Simone's program. "I'll need to credit the change to new community donations," Richard said. "We can't make it obvious you influenced this." "Perfect," Sterling said. "Just get it done." He hung up feeling triumphant, feeling powerful, feeling like he'd finally done something good with his influence. He'd saved Simone's dream. She'd get her program back, her students back, her passion back. She'd be happy again. And yes, she'd said she didn't want him to interfere, but she'd understand. She'd see he'd done this out of love. She'd forgive him because the outcome was good. Sterling Ashford, for all his growth, for all his attempts at change, had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because when you love someone who's asked you not to control them, and you go behind their back to control things anyway, even with good intentions, even for good reasons, you don't save the relationship. You end it. Sterling didn't know that yet. He spent the day planning how he'd tell her, maybe over dinner, maybe with champagne. He'd explain that he couldn't watch her suffer, that he'd used his influence for good, that he'd respected her enough to do it quietly, without demanding credit. She'd understand. She had to understand. But deep down, in a place Sterling didn't want to examine, he knew the truth. He'd failed. After months of trying to change, of learning to let go, of choosing partnership over power, he'd reverted to type at the first real test. He'd decided he knew better. He'd decided her pain justified his intervention. He'd decided that his love gave him the right to override her explicitly stated wishes. He'd become, once again, the man who controlled everything, the man who believed power could substitute for partnership, the man Simone had been falling in love with. The humble, learning, growing man had disappeared the moment things got hard. And the old Sterling, the one who used influence to bend the world to his will, had returned. Later that evening, when Simone arrived at his house for their regular dinner, Sterling could barely contain his excitement. They just sat down to eat when his phone buzzed with a text from Richard, motion passed. "Arts funding restored. Your teacher gets her program back next semester." Sterling felt a surge of satisfaction. He'd done it. He'd fixed everything. He looked across the table at Simone, who was telling Aria about a student's breakthrough. With watercolors, her face animated despite the disappointment she'd been carrying. She'd be so happy when she found out, so relieved, so grateful. "Simone," Sterling interrupted, unable to wait any longer. "I have some news." She looked up, curious. "Good news, I hope?" "The board is restoring funding to the arts program," he said, grinning. You're getting your advanced placement position back. The confusion on her face was immediate. What? How do you know that? I found out through my connections, Sterling said, intentionally vague. Apparently some new community donations came through. They're voting on it next week, but it's basically done. He reached across the table to take her hand. You're going to get everything back. But Simone didn't smile. She didn't look relieved or grateful. She looked at him with something that made Sterling's stomach drop. Suspicion, disappointment, understanding. Sterling, she said slowly, pulling her hand back. What did you do? What do you mean? I just told you. What did you do? Her voice was harder now. Did you call the board? Did you use your influence? After everything we talked about, after you promised, I didn't promise, not to help you. Sterling interrupted, feeling defensive now. You were suffering. I had the power to fix it. I couldn't just stand by and watch you lose everything you'd worked for. You went behind my back. It wasn't a question. You did exactly what I asked you not to do. I did it because I love you. Sterling stood up, frustration boiling over. I did it to help you, to give you back what you deserve. How is that wrong? Simone stood too, and Sterling saw tears in her eyes. Not tears of joy, tears of heartbreak. Because I didn't want you to, she said quietly. Because I explicitly told you not to interfere. Because I needed to know that you respected me enough to let me handle my own life, even when it was hard. Even when I failed. And you couldn't do it. You couldn't trust me. You couldn't let go. That's not fair, isn't it? Her voice cracked. Sterling, I love you. I really do. But I can't be with someone who goes behind my back the moment things get difficult, who decides his judgment is more important than my explicitly stated wishes, who uses his power to override my autonomy because he thinks he knows what's best for me. Simone, please. I need to go. She grabbed her coat, her purse. Arya watched from the table, confusion and worry on her young face. Don't do this, Sterling pleaded. Let's talk about this. I made a mistake, okay? I'm sorry. But don't throw away everything we have, because I tried to help you. Simone turned at the door, and the look she gave him would haunt Sterling for the rest of his life. It was love and disappointment and finality all mixed together. You didn't try to help me, Sterling. You tried to control me, and I can't live like that. I won't. The door closed behind her. Not a slam. Just a soft, terrible click. Sterling stood in his foyer, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Behind him, Arya's small voice. Daddy? Is Miss Jacobs coming back? Sterling didn't answer, because he didn't know, and for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he was terrified that the answer might be no. So here's the question that should keep you up at night. The question that cuts to the heart of every relationship when someone you love explicitly asks you not to interfere in their life, and you do it anyway because you believe you're helping them. Are you acting out of love? Or are you acting out of the same controlling impulse you've been trying to overcome? And if the person you love walks away because you couldn't respect their boundaries, whose fault? Is it really theirs for not accepting your help, or yours for not respecting their autonomy? Sterling Ashford was about to find out. How long does it take for a man to truly change? That's the question Sterling Ashford asked himself at 3 in the morning, 5 days after Simone walked out of his life. He stood in the exact spot where he'd watched her SUV disappear down the driveway that cold January morning, staring at the empty gravel path like it might offer answers. The Kansas winter wind cut through his robe, but he barely felt it. Physical cold was nothing compared to the emptiness that had settled into his chest like permafrost. 5 days. That's how long it had been since she'd looked at him with those devastated eyes and said the words. That kept replaying in his mind on an endless loop. You didn't try to help me, Sterling. You tried to control me. 5 days since he'd lost the woman he loved. Again. Except this time, there was no accident to blame. No random tragedy. No twist of fate. This time, Sterling had destroyed his own happiness with deliberate actions, convinced he was doing the right thing even as he violated the one boundary Simone had explicitly set. The worst part, He'd felt righteous about it, triumphant even. He'd saved her program, restored her dream, fixed the problem, and in doing so, he'd proven everything she feared about him was true. That when push came to shove, Sterling Ashford would always choose control over trust, power over partnership, his judgment over her autonomy. He'd failed. Not just failed, he'd failed spectacularly after months of trying, of learning, of believing he was changing. One test. That's all it took. One real challenge, and he'd reverted to the man he'd always been. The man who believed love meant solving problems instead of supporting people. The man who thought his wealth and influence gave him the right to orchestrate other people's lives. The man who couldn't distinguish between caring for someone and controlling them. Sterling turned back toward the mansion, its white pillars ghostly in the pre-dawn darkness. Willow Creek Estate had never felt more like a mausoleum. 40 rooms, 10,000 square feet, and every inch of it echoed with absence. Inside, Aria slept in her room, oblivious to the fact that the family she'd begun to dream about, the one with Simone teaching her to paint and cooking Ruby's recipes and filling the quiet spaces with laughter, was gone. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that you destroyed something beautiful because you couldn't stop being yourself? Sterling had been avoiding that conversation for 5 days, but he knew it was coming. Aria was perceptive. She'd noticed Simone's absence, the unanswered texts, the way Sterling moved through the house like a ghost. Soon she'd ask questions Sterling didn't know how to answer. He walked back inside, closed the door softly, and stood in his foyer surrounded by expensive art and imported marble and all the trappings of success that meant absolutely nothing without the people you loved to share them with. His phone sat on the entry table where he'd left it. No messages, no calls. Simone had gone silent. Complete radio silence. And Sterling understood why. What could she possibly say to him that she hadn't already said? What conversation could they have that wouldn't just be a rehash of the same fundamental problem, his inability to let go, her refusal to be controlled? He'd thought about calling her approximately 6,000 times in the past 5 days. Had picked up the phone, started typing messages, begun voicemails. But what would he say? I'm sorry? He'd been saying that for months, and clearly it meant nothing when he kept repeating the same behavior. I'll change. He'd promised that too, and then proved at the first real test that his promises were empty. I love you? Love without respect was just obsession. And Sterling had to face the brutal truth that he didn't respect Simone. Not really. Because if he respected her, he would have honored her explicit request not to interfere. He would have trusted her capability, her judgment, her right to fight her own battles. Instead, he decided he knew better, had acted on that belief, had proven that his love for her came with conditions and requirements, and the expectation that she'd be grateful for his interference. God, he was exhausted. Exhausted from trying to control everything. Exhausted from the mental gymnastics of justifying his behavior. Exhausted from being Sterling Ashford, CEO, billionaire, master of his domain. For the first time in his adult life, Sterling didn't want to be powerful. He wanted to be humble. He wanted to be the kind of man who could watch someone he loved struggle and not intervene. Who could trust that they were capable of handling their own life. Who could love without the need to orchestrate, manage, or fix. But wanting to be that man and actually being him were two different things. And Sterling was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, he couldn't change. That this was who he was at his core. A controller, a fixer, a man who wielded power like a tool and couldn't imagine any other way to interact with the world. If that was true, then Simone was right to leave. She deserved better than a man who would always see her as a project, who would always try to solve her problems instead of supporting her through them, who would always choose his judgment over hers. She deserved a partner, not a manager. And Sterling didn't know how to be that. The sun rose slowly over the estate, painting the snow-covered grounds in shades of pink and gold. Sterling watched it from his study window, remembering another morning months ago when Simone had stood in this same room, fingers trailing across the piano keys, firelight dancing in her eyes. That had been the night he'd known he was falling in love. The night everything had felt possible. How had they gotten from there to here? How had something so beautiful become something so broken? The answer, of course, was him. Sterling had broken this, and he had no idea how to fix it, or whether it could be fixed at all. 3 weeks passed. Sterling moved through his life like an automaton. Board meetings, business calls, picking up Aria from school. He smiled when appropriate, made decisions when required, functioned at a basic level. But inside, he was hollow. Aria finally confronted him on a Saturday morning in late January. They were having breakfast. Well, Aria was eating cereal while Sterling pushed scrambled eggs around his plate, when she set down her spoon with deliberate emphasis. "Are you going to tell me what happened with Miss Jacobs?" she asked. "Or am I supposed to just pretend I don't notice you're miserable?" Sterling looked up, surprised by the directness. When had his daughter become so perceptive? "Sweetheart, it's complicated." "You messed up," Aria interrupted. "I don't know what you did, but I know you messed up. And instead of fixing it, you're just sitting here being sad." The accuracy of that statement hit Sterling like a physical blow. "I don't know how to fix it, Aria." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I tried to help Miss Jacobs with something she explicitly asked me not to help with. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I was being controlling. And now she's gone." Aria processed this, her young face serious. "Did you apologize?" "Yes." "Did you mean it?" Sterling opened his mouth to say yes automatically, then stopped. Did he mean it? Or was he just sorry he'd gotten caught? Sorry that his actions had consequences? Sorry that Simone had left instead of accepting his help with gratitude? "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I think I'm still trying to figure out whether I did something wrong or whether she's overreacting." Aria looked at him with an expression far too wise for 12 years old. "Daddy, if someone tells you not to do something and you do it anyway, that's wrong. Even if you think you're helping, even if you are helping. Because it's not about whether you're right, it's about whether you respect them enough to listen." Out of the mouths of babes, Sterling felt tears prick his eyes. His 12-year-old daughter had just articulated the lesson he'd been failing to learn for months. It wasn't about being right. It wasn't about good intentions or effective solutions. It was about respect, about listening, about valuing someone else's autonomy more than your own need to fix things. "When did you get so smart?" he whispered. Aria shrugged. "Miss Jacobs taught me about respecting boundaries in art class. She said, just because you can add something to a painting doesn't mean you should. Sometimes you have to let the artist's vision stand on its own, even if you think you could make it better." Sterling laughed, but it came out more like a sob. Of course Simone had taught Aria that lesson. Of course she'd been preparing his daughter to understand healthy boundaries while Sterling had been systematically violating them. "So what do I do?" he asked. "How do I fix this?" "I don't think you can fix it, Daddy," Aria said gently. "I think you have to change it. Change yourself. Actually change, not just say you're going to change." She stood up, came around the table, and hugged him. "And maybe start by figuring out why you always have to be in control of everything. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exhausting." She wasn't wrong. Sterling held his daughter, this wise little human he'd somehow raised, and felt something shift inside him. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden epiphany, just a quiet recognition that Aria was right. He needed to change, really change. Not for Simone, though he desperately wanted her back, but for himself, for Aria, for any hope of having healthy relationships in the future. And change, real, lasting change, required more than good intentions and surface-level adjustments. It required understanding why he was the way he was. It required excavating the roots of his need for control and pulling them out one painful handful at a time. So Sterling did something he'd never done before. He called a therapist. Dr. Patricia Morrison was a 65-year-old woman with kind eyes and zero tolerance for bullshit. She came highly recommended by Sterling's physician, who'd suggested therapy. Years ago, when Sterling had developed stress-induced hypertension, Sterling had ignored the advice then. Now, he couldn't afford to. Their first session was awkward. Sterling sat in a leather chair in Dr. Morrison's modest office, surrounded by plants and soft lighting, and tried to explain why he was there without sounding pathetic. "I lost someone I love because I can't stop trying to control everything," he started. "And I need to figure out why I'm like this and how to change." "Doctor," Morrison nodded, taking notes. "Tell me about your childhood." Sterling almost laughed. Of course she'd start there. Wasn't that what therapists always did? But as he began talking about growing up in Texas with a father who ran an oil company with an iron fist, about learning early that power meant safety, about watching his mother defer to his father in everything, and believing that was what love looked like, Sterling realized how deep this went. "My father controlled everything," Sterling heard himself saying. "What we ate, where we went to school, who we associated with, what careers were acceptable. And my mother let him. She smiled and agreed and never challenged him, and they seemed happy. I thought that was how marriage worked. The man made decisions, and the woman trusted him to lead." "Doctor." Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. "And did your mother seem fulfilled?" The question stopped Sterling cold. Did she? He'd never really thought about it. His mother had been elegant, gracious, supportive. But fulfilled? Happy in her own right. He couldn't remember a single instance of her pursuing her own interests, making her own choices, expressing her own opinions. She'd been beautiful wallpaper in his father's life. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never asked." "And your first wife?" Sterling swallowed hard. "Margaret she was wonderful, patient, kind. She never complained when I made decisions for us. She trusted me, or she accommodated you," Dr. Morrison suggested gently. "There's a difference." The words hit Sterling like a punch. Had Margaret been happy, or had she simply been conditioned, like his mother, to defer to the powerful man in her life? He'd never know now. She was gone, and he couldn't ask her. But the question opened a chasm of doubt. What if his entire understanding of love was built on a foundation of control and compliance? What if what he'd thought was partnership was actually just management? "I think I've been doing this my whole life," Sterling said slowly. "I think I learned early that love means protecting people by making decisions for them. And I've never questioned whether that's actually love or just dominance." "Doctor," Morrison leaned forward. "Sterling, the fact that you're asking that question now means you're already changing. Real transformation starts with recognizing the pattern. What comes next is harder. You have to consistently choose different behaviors, even when every instinct screams at you to revert to the familiar." They talked for an hour, then another. When Sterling left that first session, he felt emotionally wrung out, but somehow lighter. He'd named the thing that had been driving him. He'd traced it back to its source, and while that didn't magically fix him, it gave him a roadmap. Over the following weeks, Sterling showed up to therapy religiously. He dug into uncomfortable truths about his childhood, his first marriage, his parenting. He practiced sitting with discomfort instead of immediately trying to solve it. He learned to recognize the physical sensation that preceded his controlling impulses, a tightness in his chest, a racing heart, an overwhelming urge to take action. And he learned to pause, to breathe, to ask himself, is this my problem to solve, or am I trying to solve it because I'm uncomfortable with uncertainty? The work was exhausting. Some days Sterling wanted to quit, to declare himself good enough, to convince himself that he'd learned his lesson and didn't need to keep excavating these painful truths. But then he'd think about Simone, about the look in her eyes when she'd walked away, about Aria's words, "I think you have to change it, change yourself, actually change." So he kept going, and slowly, so slowly it was barely perceptible, Sterling began to feel different. Not fixed, not cured, but different. He noticed it in small ways. When Aria came to him with a problem at school, his first instinct was still to call the teacher and fix it. But now he paused, took a breath, asked Aria what she wanted to do about it. When his assistant made a mistake on a project, he didn't immediately take over. He let her correct it herself, provided support instead of solutions. When the landscaping crew did something he didn't like at the estate, he didn't fire them. He had a conversation about expectations and gave them another chance. Baby steps, tiny adjustments, but they added up. 2 months after Simone left, Sterling was at a school fundraiser. He'd continued volunteering, because Arya asked him to, and because he'd made a commitment to the community. He was helping set up tables when he saw her. Simone, standing across the gymnasium, talking with a group of parents, looking beautiful, and tired, and so achingly familiar that Sterling's breath caught in his throat. Their eyes met for just a second. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge him beyond that brief eye contact. Then she turned back to her conversation. Sterling's first instinct was to walk over there, to talk to her, explain everything he'd been doing, tell her about therapy and change and how sorry he was. His chest tightened, his heart raced. The familiar urge to act, to fix, to control the outcome surged through him like electricity. But he paused, took a breath, asked himself the question, is this my need or hers? Am I respecting her space, or am I trying to manage the situation? The answer was clear. Simone had made her choice. She'd walked away, and she'd stayed away. If she wanted to talk to him, she knew where he was. Pushing himself into her space, demanding her attention, trying to force a conversation she might not be ready for. That would be the old Sterling, the controlling Sterling, the man who couldn't leave things alone. So Sterling stayed where he was, finished setting up the tables, left the fundraiser without approaching her. And when he got home that night, he felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction exactly, not peace, but something close. He'd seen the woman he loved, and he'd respected her boundaries. He'd felt the overwhelming urge to control the situation, and he'd resisted it. He'd chosen her autonomy over his need for resolution. It was growth, real, tangible growth, and it hurt like hell. But here's the thing about real change. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't exist in theory. It only matters when it's tested in the real world, with real stakes, in real time. And Sterling's test came 3 weeks later, in the most unexpected way. He was in his office at the estate, reviewing quarterly reports, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, probably a spam call. But something made him pick up. Mr. Ashford? A woman's voice, elderly, slightly tremulous. This is Ruby Jacobs, Simone's mother. Sterling sat up straight, heart pounding. Mrs. Jacobs, is everything okay? I need to talk to you about my daughter, Ruby said. Could you meet me? Today, if possible. 40 minutes later, Sterling sat across from Ruby in a small cafe on the edge of town. She looked older than he remembered, worry lines etched deep around her eyes. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I wasn't sure you would. Of course, Sterling replied. What's going on? Is Simone okay? Ruby sighed, stirring her coffee absently. She's struggling, Sterling, really struggling. The school board went back on their decision to restore the arts funding. Apparently the donation that made it possible fell through. Sterling's stomach dropped. Richard must have pulled the funding when Sterling didn't follow through with the campaign contribution. Politics as usual. So Simone lost her program again, Ruby continued. And this time, I think it broke something in her. She's been so sad, so defeated, won't talk about it, just goes to work, comes home, stares at the walls. She looked up at Sterling, her eyes pleading. I know what happened between you two. She told me. And I'm not asking you to fix your relationship. But Sterling, you have the power to help her get that program back. I'm asking you, as a mother who loves her daughter, please help her. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. This was it. This was the test. Sterling had the power to give Simone everything she wanted. One phone call to Richard. One strategic donation. One flexing of his considerable influence. And he could restore Simone's program, make her happy, prove that his love meant something tangible. Ruby was giving him permission, asking him even. This wasn't going behind Simone's back. This was helping, through a proxy, which was basically the same thing as respecting her boundaries, right? Sterling's chest tightened. His heart raced. Every instinct screamed at him to say yes, to fix this, to save Simone. From her pain, even if she'd never know he was the one who did it. He opened his mouth to agree, and then stopped, because Arya's voice echoed in his mind. If someone tells you not to do something and you do it anyway, that's wrong, even if you think you're helping. And Dr. Morrison's words, real transformation means consistently choosing different behaviors. Even when every instinct screams at you to revert to the familiar, and Simone's devastated eyes, you didn't try to help me, you tried to control me. Sterling closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and made the hardest decision of his life. Mrs. Jacobs, he said quietly, I can't do that. Ruby's face fell. But, Sterling, I love your daughter more than I can express, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, and nothing would make me happier than to fix this for her. But Simone explicitly asked me not to interfere in her career. She told me she didn't want me using my influence on her behalf, and even though she's suffering, even though I have the power to help, I have to respect that boundary, because that's what love actually is. It's not fixing things. It's respecting people enough to let them live their own lives, even when it's painful to watch. Tears filled Ruby's eyes. So, you're just going to let her suffer? No, Sterling said firmly. I'm going to trust that she's capable of handling this herself. I'm going to believe in her strength, her resilience, her ability to find her own way through this challenge. Because that's what she asked for, and respecting her wishes, even when they hurt, even when I disagree, is the only way I can truly love her. Ruby was quiet for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. A small, sad smile, but a smile nonetheless. You really have changed, haven't you? Sterling felt tears prick his own eyes. I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying. They parted ways shortly after. Sterling drove home feeling hollowed out but somehow whole. He'd passed the test. He'd had every justification to intervene. Ruby had asked him. Simone would never have to know. The outcome would be good, and he'd chosen respect over results. He'd chosen Simone's autonomy over his need to fix things. For the first time in his life, Sterling Ashford had wielded power by refusing to use it. And it felt like the most loving thing he'd ever done. That night, Sterling couldn't sleep. He sat in his study staring at the piano where Simone had once stood, and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. The grief, the regret, the love, the acceptance that he might never get her back, that he'd learned this lesson too late. That real change didn't guarantee a happy ending. Around midnight, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, but he recognized it immediately. Simone. His hands shook as he opened it. My mother told me about your conversation, about what you said, about what you didn't do. Sterling's heart stopped. He waited, barely breathing, for the rest of the message. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, can we talk? Tomorrow? I'm not promising anything, but I think we should talk. Sterling's hands shook so badly he could barely type his response. Yes. Whenever you want, wherever you want. The reply came quickly. The farmer's market, 10 a.m. Where this all started. So the question becomes, when you've spent months learning to let go, when they've finally proven you can respect someone's autonomy even when it costs you everything, when you've changed at the deepest level, not for a reward, not for a reconciliation, but because it was the right thing to do, what happens next? Does love get a second chance? Or does real growth mean accepting that some things, once broken, can never be fully repaired? Sterling would find out tomorrow, at the farmer's market, where Ruby sold her vegetable stew, and Simone had first let him into her world, where this whole beautiful, painful journey had begun. He didn't know what Simone would say, didn't know if she'd forgive him, or if she'd simply want closure. Didn't know if his transformation had come too late. But for the first time in his life, Sterling Ashford was okay with not knowing. He'd learned to sit with uncertainty, to trust the process, to let go of the outcome. He'd learned that love wasn't about control or power or fixing things. It was about showing up with humility, listening with respect, and trusting that the people you loved were capable of making their own choices, even if those choices didn't include you. Tomorrow, at the farmer's market, Sterling would show up. He'd listen to whatever Simone needed to say. He'd respect whatever decision she'd made. And if she'd decided to give him another chance, a real chance, with a man who'd finally learned what partnership actually meant, he'd spend the rest of his life proving that people could change, that power could be laid down, that control could be released. That love, real love, meant trusting someone else's heart more than your own need to protect it. But tonight, Sterling sat in his study and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, exactly, not peace, but something close. He felt like himself. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the man who controlled everything. Just Sterling, a man who'd learned the hardest lesson of his life, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing at all. The estate was quiet around him. Arya slept soundly upstairs, secure in the knowledge that her father was trying, really trying to be better. The moon cast silver light across the snow-covered grounds, and somewhere in town, Simone Jacobs lay awake, thinking about second chances and changed men and whether love could survive when it was rebuilt on a foundation of respect instead of control. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight brought only questions. And Sterling Ashford, for the first time in his carefully controlled life, was learning to be okay with that. So here's what I want to know from you, and I want you to really think about this before you answer in the comments below. Have you ever been the Sterling in someone's life? Have you ever loved someone so much that you tried to control them, fix them, manage them, all while believing you were helping? Or maybe you've been the Simone, loved by someone who couldn't distinguish between care and control, support and management. What did you do? How did it end? And do you believe people can really change, fundamentally change, or are we all just managing our worst impulses for as long as we can until we inevitably revert to type? Drop your stories in the comments. Tell me about the time you had to choose between helping someone and respecting their autonomy. Tell me about the person who loved you by trying to control you, or the person you lost because you couldn't let go. Because these stories, they matter. They're how we learn. They're how we grow. They're how we figure out what love actually means. And if this story resonated with you, if Sterling's journey felt familiar or painful or true, hit that subscribe button. Because we tell stories here about real people facing real problems, no sugarcoating, no easy answers. Just honest explorations of what it means to be human, to love, to fail, and to try again. This is American storytelling at its finest, raw, real, and unflinchingly honest. So, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us next time for another story that'll make you think, feel, and question everything you thought you knew about love, power, and the human heart. I'll see you in the comments. And remember, the strongest thing you can do is sometimes nothing at all.